Dragon Age: The Veilguard is the newest game from Bioware, a storied developer that has given us classics like Mass Effect, Knights of the Old Republic, and of course the previous Dragon Age games. Now, unfortunately, Bioware has been struggling as of late. The last two games before Veilguard were Mass Effect Andromeda in 2017 and Anthem in 2019. Both colossal failures. Bioware is in the hot seat right now, and Dragon Age: The Veilguard was supposed to be the game that set Bioware back on the right path. Now, I haven't played a Dragon Age game before Veilguard. The last one came out in 2014 when I was just 12 years old. Dragon Age as a franchise was a bit before my time, but what I can tell you now, as a game, Dragon Age: The Veilguard is absolutely worth your time. That doesn't mean it's without its faults, but Dragon Age: The Veilguard is a competently made RPG with a unique world, engaging story, and solid gameplay. So today, let's talk about Dragon Age: The Veilguard, what it does right, what could be improved, and why Dragon Age: The Veilguard is way better than you think. Before we begin, if you like this type of content, make sure to hit the like button and consider subscribing to see more content like this. Now, let's jump in. I want to open up this review talking about the world that this game is set in. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with the game, Veilguard is set in northern Thedas. This includes massive cities like Minrathous and Treviso, but it also features beaches in the region of Ravane, as well as luscious forests in Arlethan. Straight up, the world that Veilguard is set in is absolutely gorgeous. The world design is easily the best part of the game. I mean, look at it. The graphics are amazing and each region is super unique and varied. Like I mentioned earlier, you go from towering cities to luscious forests to serene beaches. Every world presents its unique opportunities, cultures, and quests. But if you can't tell by the gameplay, this game is not an open world. Each of these regions, Minrathous, Treviso, Ravane, they aren't free to explore however you so choose. In fact, they're kinda limited. The world may look great, and the world may be handcrafted in great ways, but you can't help but feel like you're walking through a museum. What I mean is that there isn't a whole lot of interactivity in the map at all. Paths are relatively linear with not a lot of variation when it comes to approaching an encounter. On top of that, you can't really interact with the NPCs that inhabit these worlds in a meaningful way at all. And there's not a lot of world activities that don't boil down to solving a puzzle to get to a chest that has loot in it. For a lack of a better term, each world feels kinda fishbowl-y. You're dropped into this fishbowl with tight guardrails and not a lot of interactivity inside it. Each world is very self-contained, which is fine for the most part, but some of the areas feel almost too small. For example, Minrathous is supposed to be a massive capital city, and in the opening mission of the game, you do get to experience Hightown in Minrathous. It's super unique and super cool, but you literally don't have access to Hightown at all after the first mission. Instead, the rest of the game is played out in the slums called Docktown. That type of stuff is seriously immersion breaking because one, you've been to Hightown once before. It's kinda stupid that you can't go back, and two, it's hard to believe that the rest of the story, every little encounter with the Venatori, or every NPC that could possibly be of help are all located in the one tiny district of Docktown. Another example is Treviso. Now, I will say that Treviso is by far my favorite region to look at in the game. The soaring skyline, the high-class society look, the market, it's all super interesting to look at. But a consequence that comes with creating such a pretty world is that players want to explore it, find all of its nooks and crannies and secrets that really make a city feel alive. The problem is that I want to explore Treviso more. I see these towering skyscrapers in the distance and my gut wants to go over there and explore them and see what I can find. But I can't do that. I'm contained in my little fishbowl with the same places, the same NPCs, and not a whole lot to do except for admire the pretty sights. I can't believe I'm saying this because I am so against every game needing to have an open world, but I think Dragon Age the Veilguard could have benefited from an open world and more intention with its cities. I totally understand that having two massive cities in Minrathous and Treviso is not at all feasible coupled with the various other locations, but I would have much preferred a fully realized Treviso and no Minrathous, or a fully realized Minrathous and no Treviso. Games that come to mind that have a big open city and smaller locales are The Witcher 3 and Star Wars Outlaws. I think Star Wars Outlaws' world design in particular could have been a huge benefit had it been implemented into Veilguard. Star Wars Outlaws is broken up into 5 planets, each that are self-contained. Each of these planets are unique in their own way, and a lot of them have a decently sized city in them as well. You can go into orbit around each planet, but you can't travel to another planet without essentially fast traveling. Imagine if Veilguard took the same approach. You have a fully realized Treviso and all the same other regions that are present in the game, but this time you can feel free to travel to them however you see fit. You can use the alluvians that are basically a way of fast traveling, or you could take the long way, maybe by boat or something else. Look, I don't want it to come across as if I don't like the world. I honestly love it. I think the world design, locations, and everything in between is truly good. But I have some critiques, and I have some things that I think could have really helped out the immersiveness of this world. I want an open world because I want to be engrossed in it. I want to spend time traveling between locations and climbing the tallest tower because I like the world that much. But hey, what good is a gorgeous world if there's not good gameplay to back it up? Thankfully, I can confidently say that the gameplay is honestly pretty alright. Frankly, there's not a ton here, but what is present is pretty solid. Let's start with the combat. So at the beginning, you can pick between 3 classes: Warrior, Mage, and Rogue. Each offer their unique way of dealing with encounters. Warrior is more up close in your face, Mage is more of the long range option, and Rogue is kind of a balance between both. I went with Rogue for my playthrough as I felt like it had the best balance for the type of character I wanted to play. From there, the combat is pretty fast paced. You and 2 of your party members engage in moment to moment combat with light attacks, heavies, range attacks, and some special abilities thrown in between. It's very akin to Hogwarts Legacy in my opinion. In that game, you had a basic cast and then other spells that basically did different things. It was up to you on how you wanted to play those spells, but they had a cooldown after they were used, so you were incentivized to use your basic attacks in between. Veilguard is very similar in that extent. You have cooldowns when you use your abilities, and thus you have to rely on your regular and heavy attacks as well. The 2 added party members also have their own attacks and abilities. One cool feature is that if you have 2 members in your party whose abilities complement each other, they deal more damage than if they were used separately. For example, if I had a companion in my party that applies Sundered and another in my party that detonates Sundered, if I use their abilities together on the same enemy, they deal bonus damage. For the first couple of times, this combo effect is really cool. But as you play more and more with each companion, you learn which companions are best to be paired up. This meant that if I wanted to maximize my companions, I had to pair them up with the same people every time. This kind of limited the various combinations I could make with my companions, as they all only had one other suitor when it came to combining their abilities. Enemy variety also isn't great, to be honest. You have the Venatori, the Antom, and then some other brutes, but they almost always felt the same every time. On top of that, enemies are insane damage sponges. Usually, I don't mind enemies scaling up their health with your level, so throughout the runtime of a game, you're consistently challenged, but in Veilguard, the basic enemy types can sometimes take up to 20 to 30 hits before they go down. Once you get your specific movesets and abilities you like, combat is not very difficult at all, and it feels like each combat encounter is artificially made longer by the damage sponge enemies. Look, overall, I don't think the combat is bad at all, but it's also not great either. There is some genuine fun to be had in the combat, especially during the early hours of the game, but as the game goes along and you've figured out which moves and abilities you like, and you've paired up your companions, the combat starts to feel a little samey. Outside of the combat, there's not a whole lot of moment-to-moment gameplay that's present in the game. If you aren't in a combat encounter, chances are you're exploring the world, questing, or finding loot. All of it's pretty basic, but it kind of works for Veilguard. Maybe I'm a simpler guy, but I don't need a ton of open world activities to always keep me busy. What is here, the questing, the exploring, and the looting, is serviceable enough for the runtime of the game. It's not anything super innovative, and the loot can absolutely be a chore to get to sometimes. But surprisingly, I did not get bored with this aspect of the game in my playthrough. Now, I can't say that I won't get bored in subsequent playthroughs, because at the end of the day, games like this aren't meant to be only played once. With all the different story and character choices, as well as the different combat builds you can create, Dragon Age the Veilguard is meant to be replayed more than once. And for me, I can absolutely see the combat and world activities getting boring for me on a second or third playthrough. A lot of replayability is subjective though. Personally, I'm someone who almost never does a second or third playthrough of a game. I have so many games I want to get through or play that I find myself never going back unless I really like the game. But for some, after they finish their first playthrough, they're immediately jumping into a second one. So your mileage may vary when it comes to the world activities and exploration. The last thing I want to talk about gameplay wise is the progression. I truly think this is the best part of the gameplay in Veilguard. I really like the different classes that you have, and the way you build out your character feels unique. For example, I mentioned earlier that I went with a rogue build in my playthrough. As I progressed through the game and leveled up my character, there was a moment where I could specialize in an additional skill tree outside of the base one that's already present. I got to choose if I wanted to focus on hand-to-hand combat and become a duelist, if I wanted to focus more on ranged combat and become a Veil Archer, or if I wanted to focus more on abilities and stacks and become a Saboteur. All of these specializations felt unique to the rogue class's unique skill set, which I really appreciated. Your companions also have their unique skill trees, but they are way more basic and don't really allow for a ton of customization on how you want your companion to play. The other progression that's present is the loot progression. I think that the loot progression is pretty hit or miss here. The Fortnite colored loot that signifies tier is here in Veilguard, and I don't really know if it works. Basically, there are two ways you can upgrade your loot. There's rarity, like I mentioned earlier, which is signified by the color of your loot. As you get higher in rarity, a new ability of the weapon or armor unlocks with it. You can get these rarity upgrades by either finding them in chests in the open world or buying them from vendors. This system doesn't really work for me. I appreciate the fact that there's not just one weapon that has better stats than the rest, so you keep that weapon until a new one comes along with better stats, but that also means that whenever you open a chest, the chances that you're getting an upgrade to the weapon or armor set that you actually use is next to nothing. That's why it's almost always more worth it to buy the upgrades from vendors. But each vendor is tied to a faction that's present in the game, and so items are locked until you get their faction trust up. Because of this, I was always in a scenario where I was using an item that was a lower rarity because it had better base stats than the ones that I had that had higher rarity. This problem is compounded by the fact that you can just also upgrade the base stats of each weapon or armor without increasing their rarity. Again, this provides a scenario where I was using a rare sword when I had an epic one in my inventory solely because it had higher DPS than the epic one that was already in my inventory. Look, at the end of the day, I think the gameplay is honestly pretty okay to good in Dragon Age the Veilguard. If you're only planning on doing 1 or 2 playthroughs at most, there's enough here for 100 or so hours of fun. But beyond that, I think it's tough to say Dragon Age the Veilguard innovates in a way that will keep me coming back for playthrough after playthrough. But gameplay may not be the only reason someone may come back to a game. Let's talk about the story. Non-spoilers first and then spoilers at the end. I know there's been a lot of talk about the story and dialogue in Veilguard, and I'll be the first to say that yes, the dialogue at times is a little cringy and basic, but I truly do not think the story is as bad as people are making it out to be. It's not some whimsical, low-stakes story that has you trekking through Thedas for the sake of trekking through Thedas. The story can absolutely get deep at times. The ending is phenomenal, and while I think more agency could have been given to the player when it came to making decisions early in the story, the ending more than makes up for it. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's talk about the story as spoiler-free as possible. The premise of the story is pretty simple. Solus, or the Dreadwolf, is planning on taking down the Veil, a magical, well, veil in the sky that shields Thedas from the Fade, a magical realm full of demons and gods. Your job is to stop him, but in the process of doing so, you accidentally release two elven gods hell-bent on controlling all of Thedas and bringing it under their rule once again. From there, the story involves you building up a team capable of taking down these gods and then going and destroying them once and for all. Overall, I think the premise is pretty solid. Now, like I mentioned in the intro, I'm not someone who's familiar with the Dragon Age franchise, but all the recurring characters, plot lines, and lore is written well enough to the point where I could understand what was happening without having any prior knowledge, and also without the game also feeling like it's hand-holding me through every lore drop and explaining things like I'm 5 years old. To me, that is good writing. When it feels like every conversation you have isn't just an exposition drop, that's good writing, but that's not necessarily good dialogue. Let me explain. Good writing is a good story, with good characters, with good motives for doing the things that they do, and all that is true for Dragon Age the Veilguard. I know why Balara is wanting to join me in hunting down these gods, the same way I know why Nev wants to help as well. But how you convey that story, and the emotions you evoke out of these characters, that's dialogue. And Veilguard absolutely struggles to a degree in that respect. Whether that's shitty voice acting or the tone of the dialogue, everything that each of these characters say feels superficial at times. It's almost like the story is telling a character that they should feel angry, and so words that convey an angry person are said, but there's no emotion there that actually makes them feel angry. When you're uncontrollably angry, you're gonna say things that maybe you don't mean, or maybe you cry from that emotion, or maybe you curse. None of that is present here. Anytime a character is trying to convey that they're angry, it almost just sounds like they're mildly annoyed or mildly inconvenienced. Speaking of the companions, let's talk about them. I like them for the most part. They all play kind of a stereotype. The witty necromancer, the hardened veteran, the frantic technician, but they all play it well enough and stick true to the stereotype well enough that it kind of works. There are definitely moments where I would have wished that they showed more emotion, like I mentioned earlier, but each companion questline, with the exception of one, are written well enough to where I actually cared about all the characters and I wanted what was best for them. The last thing I want to talk spoiler-free wise is the decisions you make in the game. This is a Bioware game after all, and decisions and consequences are kind of their whole thing. And to be honest, I wish there was more of it here. Almost all of the decision making happens in the final missions of the game. You make maybe 2 or 3 decisions throughout the 45 to 50 hours of Act 1 and 2. This is extremely disappointing because, like I said, I like the premise of the story, a lot even. And I liked my companions enough to where I wanted to make those tough decisions that may have had consequences down the line. This also hurts the replayability of the game quite a bit too. A lot of people replay these games for the decisions you make in the story, seeing how the different decisions affect the outcome of the story, but when in the first 50 or so hours of the game, there's barely any decisions to be made, and the ones that are present don't really have the impact on the story that they should, it's hard to justify replaying the game just to see the differences. The only time the decisions were really worth a damn were in the end. Speaking of the ending, this is your official warning for spoilers of the story up ahead. I want to talk about the ending of the game because I feel like it's such a stark contrast from the rest of the game. Like I mentioned earlier, the story isn't light and whimsical by any means. but it also isn't the darkest, grittiest story by any means either. That all changes in the end. When you learn that Solus, a man you thought that had been helping you all this time stop Elgernon and Gillenane, was in fact using blood magic to make you think Varric was alive the whole time, when he in fact had been dead since the beginning of the game when Solus stabbed him, was crazy. The blame of everything that went wrong in the story shifted from Elgernon and Gillenane to Solus. He may have wanted you to stop the elven gods, but it wasn't because he cared about restoring peace to Thedas, it was because he wanted it for himself. I also loved the decisions you made throughout Act 3, deciding who had the best skill set for each facet of the attack, and then seeing if your decisions actually played out to the way you were hoping, or if you lost companions because you put them in situations they weren't totally comfortable in. That's the type of decision making I wanted to see throughout the entirety of the game, and not just have it be reserved to the ending. They easily could have done something similar for the Siege of Weishaupt mission at the end of Act 1 as well. I also liked the multiple endings that were present in the game. Choosing if you wanted to give Solus a fake dagger in hopes that he wouldn't know, entrapping him in the Fade forever, or choosing to try and talk him down using his love interest, the Inquisitor. All of this is the stuff that I wish wasn't just reserved to the ending of the game. I know I sound like a broken record right now, but this game had so much potential in this regard, and the talent these writers have is truly put on display in the ending moments of this game. But it almost feels like the first two acts were written by an entirely different team, a team that valued simplicity in streamlining all decisions instead of letting the player run free in decisions at the expense of some simplicity. It's truly a shame that this type of writing and dialogue wasn't present in the rest of the game. Look, at the end of the day, Dragon Age the Veilguard is a competently made RPG with a beautiful world, solid combat, and a pretty solid story that has some impact as you near the end of it. It's not a 10 out of 10 game. Hell, it's not even an 8 out of 10 game. There are some serious flaws present that can absolutely turn someone off of this game, but to call it a bad game? No. Dragon Age the Veilguard is not a bad game. If you like fantasy RPGs, and you don't have anything to play right now, this game is worth your time for at least one playthrough. It may not keep you busy for hundreds and hundreds of hours, but it will definitely keep you engaged for 70. Dragon Age the Veilguard is the epitome of a 7 out of 10. I want to take a moment and talk about the lost art that is a 7 out of 10 game. I feel like we as a community have gotten to a point where unless a game is a total 10 out of 10 masterpiece, it's not worth playing. People remember the 2010s as a golden age of gaming. We've gotten so many classics like Dishonored, Red Dead Redemption, Far Cry 3, but for every one of those innovative masterpiece games, there were games like Assassin's Creed Syndicate, Call of Duty Ghosts, Far Cry 4, games that were good games, just not masterpieces. Without those types of games that help set foundations for what a sequel could look like or how a game in its similar genre could improve, Dragon Age the Veilguard is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But I really hope Bioware gets the funding for a sequel, because at the end of the day, I enjoyed Dragon Age the Veilguard, and I really hope to see a sequel that builds on the combat and progression systems of the game and improves on the storytelling and dialogue. One can hope. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked Dragon Age the Veilguard, I really want to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you disliked it, also let me know in the comments. I want to talk about this game because it's one of those games that I think is definitely a 7 out of 10 and I think deserves to be played by the majority of people. It's a good game with some solid mechanics. It's just not perfect. But other than that, if you like this type of content, again, please make sure to hit that like button and consider subscribing if you've made it to the end of the video. Either way, though, it's been CGG. I'm out.